Hi, everyone. Hope you're all doing well. It's nice to see you again. Today, we have a very exciting talk by David and Zitai. But before we start, let me make two short announcements. First of all, because of the German government's regulations that were shared last week, we decided to move our upcoming trainings online. All trainings will be carried out on Zoom and on Discord. And please, if you're interested, check out our website. And if you have any questions, just drop us a mail and we are happy to help. A second announcement is that if anyone from the audience has any job openings, let us know and we'll be happy to announce it on our job Discord channel. Today we have Zitai and David with us. David is a senior lecturer in the Center for Cybersecurity and Privacy at the University of Birmingham, and Zitai is a PhD student at Birmingham University. Today they will present their research in which they will address several hardware and software vulnerabilities that allow an attacker to subvert Intel's SGX technology security guarantees. Today's webinar will consist of a 30-minute technical talk followed by a 10-minute Q&A. If you have any questions, please send them across the Zoom chat and we will answer them when the presentation is over. Without further delay, I would like to invite you to start your presentation.
Okay, let me start a screen share.
Good. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm David from Birmingham, and thanks again for inviting us to speak here. And with me, Zitai. Zitai will do the second half of the talk. And if you wondered about this weird title, you have to read it really with a good rhythm. Stealing secrets from Intel vaults with side channels and voltage faults. Yeah, so it's like a rhyme. It's a verse. So that's why it's a bit weird and artificial. Okay, so what will we? Oops, sorry. Before I start, I just wanted to say that all the work we'll be presenting is kind of like a combination of many different papers and research projects. So we have quite a lot of co-authors. We have quite a lot of funding behind it. So thank you very much for that. So what do I want to talk about today, or what do we want to talk about today? We talk about trusted execution environments. And as you can see from this table, there are actually quite a lot, and probably more than even fit on this slide. And they have all different like realizations. What they all have in common is that trusted execution environments allow you to kind of shield some particularly important computation in some trusted area. And the core idea is that even somebody who has gained root on your CPU, say some malware or so, cannot look into this trusted execution environment, or often called an enclave as well. So clearly we will not talk about all of them, but only one of them today. And that is quite a popular one because it's built into most recent Intel CPUs. So if you're watching this on an Intel laptop, chances are it also has SGX in it. And as you can see in this table, it allows you to run arbitrary code in such enclaves. And on the other hand, it has a lot of resource sharing with the untrusted code where malware might be running, because it runs just on your normal CPU. So you already can get a feel that there might be quite a big attack surface. So as I said, SGX is a bit of hardware and microcode extensions in your Intel CPU to run arbitrary x86 code in such enclaves. And what you want to do is you want to protect against an attacker who has gained root on the untrusted side. And depending on who you ask at Intel, I guess, even an attacker with physical access. So what they do is they encrypt all the data that goes to external DRAM. And especially the fact that you can protect kind of against the physical attacker has made this very popular in cloud computing. So many big vendors such as Microsoft or Google Cloud have jumped on this and provide these Intel VMs. And the idea is you take kind of like the cloud provider out of the threat model. So that's why I said a bit, depending on who you ask, they will tell you that it even protects against a cloud provider. That's a bit hazy. Zitai will tell you more about this. Okay, so if you think about an enclave, it's a bit like a fortress, right? So very nice, high, thick walls, and you want to get into it. And since the Middle Ages, people have thought about how to break into such a fortress. And for SGX, there has been a lot of excellent prior work by, for instance, Jo von Bulk and others, such as the foreshadow attack, which is yet another method that I will not talk about. So I will, however, start with one aspect of our work, which is let's go through the door. And what is kind of the door in an enclave? That's the I/O interface. So that's the interface how you pass data into an enclave and get a result out. And necessarily you have to have that. Otherwise, the enclave would be pretty useless. So in our work, we found a lot of vulnerabilities about validating where pointer arguments live. And that is because you have this distinction between trusted and untrusted memory, and there can be all kinds of confusion. So if you're familiar with how the kernel operates, you have this kernel and user checks that you have to do. And similarly in SGX, you have to check if it's inside the enclave and outside the enclave. Sounds easy, but actually you can make subtle mistakes. So just one random or one interesting example I want to show here is that one. It's from the Intel SDK. And what they used to do is they have a way of passing in string arguments, and they need to check that the string is completely outside the enclave. And how you do that is you get a pointer, and then they call string lengths to determine where does the string end, right? That's the only thing you have to do. And then they check is the whole buffer outside the enclave and reject the call otherwise. If you pass an in enclave address here. So that looks correct, but there's actually some side channel leakage from a software point of view in that. And why is that? Well, string lengths will iterate until it hits the first null byte. So if you precisely time that, and actually there are better mechanisms you can use in the context of SGX to exactly find out how many times has string length iterated, you will get the offset of the first null byte from an arbitrary in enclave address. And of course, later, formally, that call is rejected, but still you can measure the time until you get this return here. And from that, you learn this position of the null byte. And that sounds, again, quite harmless. It's like a read zero primitive, but we built a proof of concept where we extracted a full AES and AES key from an SGX enclave using that. So how does that work? We used actually the AES extensions that only operates on registers, and I said pointer, so pointer is memory, but there's a trick that you can use. You can precisely interrupt the enclave. It will then write its state to something called the SSA frame, and then we use our null byte oracle on this SSA frame. So that is not that SSA frame lives inside enclave memory, so is protected. But now we use kind of like the ability of the enclave to leak some information about that. So we call the string length oracle on that SSA frame where we, from a second thread, where we have interrupted the enclave and we get the first null byte in the AES state before the final round. And now if you know a bit about how AES works, if you know that there was somewhere a null byte, you can compute that null, put it through the S box. And on the other side, you also know the ciphertext byte. And if you XOR the two together, you get 1 byte of the round key. Repeat that 16 times until you had, with different inputs, until you had a null everywhere. And you learn the whole final round key, and that in AES gives you the AES key. So just a quick demo of that. It looks complicated, but it's actually very quick, so you almost cannot see it. With about 520 calls to the enclave, we have here recovered the complete round key. And as I said, there used to be a lot of different software vulnerabilities, including these like software side channels in popular SGX SDKs. So that was software, and you see I'm doing a quick walkthrough here or run through together with Zitai. And now we look at another way you can, let's say, break into or get secrets out of such an SGX fortress. For instance, you can try to use a very good telescope or something to spy on the enclave from the outside. So now we're in the domain of using side channels, like real side channels, such as power side channels, which some of you might know either from your work or also from watching some of the other webinars. I think there was quite a bit about power analysis, so I'll only be very brief here. So it turns out if you want to do power analysis on your Intel CPU, you need an oscilloscope, but that's very nicely built into your CPU by Intel. And it's called RAPL, running average power limit. And it allows you to read actually the energy consumption of the CPU at any time. And even worse, there are multiple ways you can actually do that even as an unprivileged user, because the Linux kernel allowed that. And that did not only allow attacks from untrusted code into SGX, but also from user mode code into the kernel. So how does it work? You call this RAPL interface, and you get, this should actually read not power consumption, but energy consumption. So you get the energy that is integrated up by the CPU all the time. So you do that before you run your target. You run your target operation, say AES or something. And then you may measure the energy consumption again using RAPL. And the difference gives you the energy that was used by your target. And from there, it's the domain of normal, kind of like normal power analysis attacks. So you can run something like simple power analysis. You can run differential power analysis. And I just want to really give a flavor here of the attacks. The main takeaway is that actually you don't need to use like an oscilloscope and connect it to your computer. You can do that completely remotely just by reading some system files. So if you try that, for instance, for running different instructions, you get quite different energy consumption profiles. So you have, for instance, a flush instruction here that has maybe a mean energy of like 1070 or so picojoules. And on the other hand, you have like a move from memory that has 1200 picojoules. So you can already see that there's some dependency on the instructions. And it turns out there's also some dependency on the data that is processed. So this operand loaded from memory here will also be visible in RAPL measurements to some extent. So some examples of things you can do with that and more is in the paper. The attack, by the way, is called Platypus. So that's why like this nice platypus down here. And the idea is this platypus can actually detect with, I think with the snout or whatever, electricity. So that's where the name comes from, if somebody wondered. So as I said, anyway, RAPL is exposed by the kernel to unprivileged users. So we can attack kernel level code, and you can use that to break kernel address space layout randomization, which is probably one of the most attacked things in the kernel. But you can also break even crypto code running in the kernel with that, and more is in the Platypus paper. And for SGX, similar thing, but you can also single step enclaves if you want. So you cannot look into it, but you can make it only go one step, and then you can run a simple power analysis, for instance, on something like an RSA signature generation or so. And if you look at this is now over instructions over time, and these are different energy domains you can measure. You can, with a good eye, you can actually read off the key for used in the RSA signature here. So you see there's like this area that was a 1, then you have a 0 that has some peak in it, pattern 1, 0, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, and so on. So that is an example for simple power analysis known since the late 90s, but now applied to a modern CPU and purely from software. And we can also do other things such as differential power analysis on something like this AES-NI instruction set, and that way break, again, the security guarantees of SGX by using some side channel leakage here. So the summary, we have power consumption that depends on the data. And what makes these attacks very interesting is that in contrast to cache timing attacks, which some of you might know, this is an attack that even works on completely protected code against something like a cache timing attack. because you can have just like a fixed instruction sequence fetching values from a constant memory location or so, and still you will get leakage on the actual values that has been pulled. And even AES-NI, which is one of the reasons why it exists, is to protect against timing-based side channels that is broken by Platypus. So the fix was two-stage kind of. One is take away the privilege for somebody to do this without being root, and that prevents, of course, any kernel attack, because if you root, then you can clearly do stuff to the kernel. And then to protect SGX, where we assume that you have root privileges as an attacker, Intel had to go one layer deeper and actually change the microcode to disable this functionality, this RAPL functionality, while you're inside an enclave. So this is now mitigated by Intel, and a good reason again to, if you rely on SGX, to patch such systems. So with that, I think I'll hand over to Zitai, who will now go to kind of like the inverse to side channels, namely fault injection.
Okay, thanks, David, for talking about the previous two ideas. So here I'll talk about another idea, which is deprive some resource from outside. So in terms of the CPU, it means we can deprive some voltage, like doing undervolting attack on CPU. So we'll think of a traditional undervolting attack. You may think that we need some expensive and custom built hardware, and we also need to connect a lot of wires from the motherboard or the board to do undervolting. But here we are introducing two very straightforward attack. One is Plundervolt, the other is VoltPillager. So the Plundervolt is a pure software-based approach of changing the voltage of the CPU, like doing the undervolting. And VoltPillager is a very simple tool which can be built with only $30 to inject fault to the CPU. Also with voltage undervolting. And let's first have a look at the Plundervolt. So you may wonder, how can we use some software interface to undervolt the Intel CPU? This is because there is actually a MSR 150 register built in this CPU, and this register has been used by some gamers for overclocking to have more performance of their CPU. And also someone may want to use this register to undervolt their CPU to save some power and also make it generate less heat. So we found that we can control relative undervolting or set an absolute voltage using this interface. And on the bottom, it shows the layout of this register. As you can see, we can set which plane we want to do undervolting for, such as CPU core or GPU core. And we can also set a 11-bit signed voltage offset in units of 1 millivolt. So after we found this interface, we tried to do a simple proof of concept of this multiply operation. As you can see here, we firstly calculate the correct value of this multiply operation, like multiply that bit by that multiplier value. And then we run exactly the same calculation again and again in this while loop, and check if the calculation result equals to the correct value. So if this code runs correctly, we should never exit this while loop, right? But actually with undervolting, if we start undervolting at here and stop undervolting at here, like doing undervolting of this multiply operation, we were able to inject the fault into this operation and cause a bit flip. So actually we were able to break outside of this while loop. So here is our proof of concept. And on the right, it shows how many volts we do undervolting for. And on the left, as you can see, we run this multiplier operation inside the enclave. And we gradually lower the CPU voltage, and at minus 265 milliwatt, we get a fault at here. So if we XOR the correct result with the calculation result we have, we will find that there is a bit flee for this calculation. So you may argue that because writing to this MSR register require root access, so maybe this is not a valid attack. But as talked earlier, since the threat model of SGX assumes that attacker has root access, and sometimes even believe that attacker has physical access, so our attack can be perfectly fit into this threat model of SGX. And also with Plundervolt, we are able to do key extraction attack on CRT RSA and also AES-NI with differential fault analysis. And we were able to introduce memory safety vulnerabilities in a bug-free enclave code. This is because if we are accessing a field in a structure array, there is multiplier operation involved. So because we can fault this multiplier operation, we certainly can fault this operation when it's trying to writing to some field in a structure array. So we also did responsible disclosure to Intel in December 2019, and they assigned us a CVE number, and they released a microcode updated for this fix. And we later applied this patch to our Intel NUC. Actually, it's a microcode update together with a BIOS update. So we found that there is a new option allow user to turn off software undervolting interface in MSR 150. But as mentioned before, as in the SGX threat model, they clearly assume that people can have hardware access. So we start to think about if we can do this using a hardware attack. So then we firstly try to figure out how the CPU is controlling the voltage. So with Plundervolt, we were able to run untrusted code and write to this memory mapped registers. And after writing to it, the CPU will send some command to an external voltage regulator. And this voltage regulator will change the CPU voltage. So the Intel patch basically disabled this interface, but there is still a physical connection between the CPU package and the voltage regulator. So we think if we can take over of this interface or inject some command to this interface, maybe we can directly change the CPU voltage. So we did some research and found this is called a SVID bus. So we did some reverse engineering of this SVID bus for its protocol and the data frame. And then we were able to build our VoltPillager to inject SVID command to this bus and change the CPU voltage. So here is what we found for this SVID bus. It's a 3-wire interface which has clock, data, and alert. And the alert is not required in the actual implementation. And the clock is at 25 megahertz, and it operates between 0 watt and 1 watt. And also with a help of a screenshot of a logic analyzer, and also some monitoring of this SVID bus, we were able to discover its data frame is shown on the left. And we were also able to find these VID commands. So these VID commands are used for control of this voltage regulator. So the most interesting one is this one, set to any fast. So with this command, we were able to change the CPU voltage to a specific value. And here shows our setup. As you can see here, we have this motherboard laying in our hardware lab, but the university is under lockdown, so we have set up remote access to it. And we connected a Raspberry Pi to the power switch of this motherboard. This is because we are doing undervolting. The CPU may become unstable. So if it crashes, we need a way to we need a more easier way to reset it to do a power cycle. And also we connect this oscilloscope to monitor the CPU voltage and this SVID bus. And what's interesting is at here. So here is, if we zoom this in, you can see that there are two wires, very thin wires, soldered out from the motherboard and connected to a bus driver. And then this is our tool together with this TINZE 4.0, which is a which performs very well and very magic effective microcontroller development board, which allows us to send SVID command to this bus. So you may wonder, why do I need a bus driver? So this is because the SVID bus operates between 0 and 1 watt, but our TINZE 4.0 operates between 0 and 3.3 watts. So we need a bus driver to convert the voltage for us. And as mentioned before, this setup, our VoltPillager is very cost effective. It can be built with only $30. So of course, excluding the Raspberry Pi and the oscilloscope. And this greatly lower the bar for conducting this attack. And here is our proof of concept against this open enclave file encryptor. So on the top shows the live capture of the oscilloscope screen. And this channel 1 is the CPU voltage. And this is the trigger signal. And this is the monitor of this SVID bus. And as you can see, after we're sending the SVID command to set the CPU voltage to be lower, the CPU voltage has a drop. And after a while, we send another command to recover the CPU voltage. The CPU voltage is back to normal. And we do this voltage glitching to the CPU for a few times. And after a while, we get a calculation error in this open enclave file encryptor. So with two of this AES fault, we were able to use differential fault analysis to recover the key used in this encryption operation. So then we discovered our findings to Intel, and their response is that opening the case and tampering of internal hardware to compromise SGX is out of scope of SGX threat model. But as you can see earlier, even in the somebody tweet that he thinks that attacker can have full control of the system. So some cloud providers, as talked earlier by David, also advocate this SGX for protecting the code and data inside it, even the code is running in untrusted infrastructures. So the cloud providers certainly have access to the server, like the computing hardware, right? So with our finding, we may need to rethink of this SGX threat model. Can it still protect against these hardware attacks? So that's all for me, and I'll give the rest of time to David for future challenges.
You're on mute, David.
Yes, classic, I saw. I just want to thank Zita, and I just want to explain also what a geographical enclave is here. You have actually Germany has an enclave. I didn't know that before I worked on SGX. It's called Büsingen, and it's completely surrounded by the territory of a foreign state, Switzerland. If you want to go here from Hilsingen, yeah, to Büsingen, then you have to pass through Switzerland. And it's a really complicated situation if you have this enclave. So you can read the Wikipedia page. It looks like your life gets harder if you live in such an enclave. Yeah. So I just want to wrap up the talk, really. I think we have seen different kinds of attacks. So of course we have software level attacks, and they can also exist in enclave code. So I just showed one example. Many people now write their enclave code in something like Rust, but surprisingly, there are also bugs remaining in that, just of a different nature sometimes. You have hardware level attacks of all sorts. So I think defending against them will be irrelevant, especially if we want to uphold this promise that you can kind of like throw your computation into an untrusted cloud, and the cloud provider is out of your threat model. Then you want something like what a smart card or so provides. So you need countermeasures, but you might not need them for everything. So one thing we're currently looking into is are so-called capability architectures, where you enhance pointers with metadata, essentially. Runs in the UK under Digital Security by Design technologies. And that can, on the one hand side, be used to verify the pointer provenance, if you want. So is this trusted? Is this untrusted memory? I think it also has quite interesting implications for controlling countermeasures. So you might not protect your whole enclave against power analysis or something, or fault injection, but your crypto code might well be protected then. It might be slower, but you might be able to accept that. And in general, I think while SGX has been very deeply scrutinized, not only by us, but by many others, I think there's still the case to make more open and inspectable hardware, and in that extends to trusted execution environments. So there are many interesting academic projects around building different trusted execution environments, playing with the architecture, finding out what is realistic. And I hope that will then in the long run also feed into what you find in your ARM processor or your Intel processor or similar. So that's all from us. So if you have any specific questions afterwards, you can also send us an email. I think I just answer one question about availability of slides. I don't know if hardwear.io puts them online, but if you want slides, then you can also just email us, of course, and then we can give you a PDF. Good.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. We have a few questions in the chat box. I don't know if you saw them. Would you like me to read them out loud to you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, why not? I think it's better for everyone to have it on the recording, right?
So Amardeep is asking, do these RAPL have dedicated x86 instructions as you show power measurements on individual instructions? Otherwise, I didn't quite catch how calling the RAPL API allows you to measure the power of a MOV inside the SGX environment.
Okay, so so I can take that. So I think there are multiple things to that question. So RAPL itself goes through model-specific registers. So there is a specific instruction to read a model-specific register. If you root, you can just call that instruction. Otherwise, you have to read from a specific file in the kernel file system. So you can try to measure one single instruction, but usually you get energy consumption 0 because the RAPL interface just adds it up. And there's like a threshold kind of when you start to see something. But how we do this is we repeat the instructions many times and add them up. So we do this for average power consumptions. And for SGX, to answer that part, you actually have very powerful single stepping primitives. So you can run every single instruction in SGX, like step by step. And even worse, you can also repeat an instruction many times. So you can run an enclave, which is completely still secure, but you can say, I want to run instruction 255, and then you run it again and again and again and again, and you run it many times. So everything you see in the slides is always an average of something, because just like as you would do in power analysis attacks, you rarely work with like a single trace. Yeah. So that's like answer one for this particular plot. When you do everything in user mode to just understand how the leakage looks like, then you run the instruction many times identically and average up. Otherwise, in SGX, you can achieve the same for every single instruction in the enclave.
Thank you, David, for answering the question. We also have another one from Asmita. She's asking, there could be many parallel processes running on the processor. In that case, how do you decide the timing to trigger the glitch for your targeted process or targeted instruction?
So I can take that question. So I think someone still has already mentioned in the chat that there is a kernel module which can set the thread affinity and force a thread onto a logic core. So that is one approach to make this parallel make our attack less affected by the parallel. But we also implement the trigger functionality, which we can send a trigger command through a serial port to this VoltPillager and to trigger the glitch. So before the target code, we can just run one line of code to say, oh, we want to trigger this glitch now, and then we run the target code, and this ensure that we inject the glitch in the target code area.
And I think in addition, then, yeah, you run it multiple times, you get lucky ones.
Yeah.
And also, again, here you have like this SGX property that you can very, very precisely, you could even go like to the point in the enclave if you want to do it to the extreme. And then you go to the point and you run that point multiple times maybe, or you inject your glitch exactly there. So you trigger from untrusted code, but you hit the trusted code.
Thank you very much for answering the questions. Are there any more questions? Yes, I think that's all. Yes, thank you very much once again for your presentation. It was really interesting. Guys, please don't forget to fill in the feedback form so that we can get a feedback of your experience. And also it would be great if you would give David and Zitai a shout out on social media. Thank you once again for your presentation, and see you next week for our upcoming webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you.
Bye.
See you.
See you.